The key turned in the lock before Rosalind Hartley even realized her hand had reached for it. She should not have been in this part of the house. Every maid at Wexford Hall knew the East Wing was forbidden, sealed since before most of the staff had been hired. Its long corridor kept dark and silent behind a door that was never supposed to open. But the housekeeper had sent her up with a stack of linens for the far storage room, and somewhere between the third staircase and the narrow hallway, Rosalind had taken a wrong turn. The door was not locked. That alone should have stopped her. Instead, it made her curious. She pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning under years of stillness, and stepped into a room heavy with dust and old air. Sheets covered the furniture like pale ghosts. A broken clock sat frozen on the mantel. Its hands stopped at a moment no one now remembered. And above the fireplace, half hidden beneath a curtain someone had once tried to close over it, hung a painting. Rosalind's breath caught in her throat. The portrait showed a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, in a blue dress with lace at the collar, her dark curls tied back with a ribbon. The artist had captured her expression with unsettling precision, a slight tilt of the chin, a spark of stubbornness in the eyes, a small scar above the left eyebrow. Rosalind had that same scar. She had gotten it falling from a tree as a child, or so she had always been told. She stepped closer, her candle trembling in her hand, and stared at the face in the frame. It was not similar to her own face. It was her own face, the same eyes, the same faint dimple on the right cheek, the same scar in the same place. "That can't be me," she whispered. But some part of her, some old and buried part, was already certain that it was. Footsteps sounded in the corridor behind her, unhurried, deliberate. Rosalind turned, her heart slamming against her ribs, and found herself facing the Duke of Wexford himself. Alaric Thorne stood in the doorway, tall and composed, his sharp eyes moving from her face to the painting and back again. For a moment, something flickered across his expression. Not anger, but something closer to alarm. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "I lost my way, Your Grace." "I am sorry." She dropped her gaze, the candle wax dripping onto her knuckles, though she barely felt the heat. "I did not mean to intrude." He did not move from the doorway. His attention returned to the portrait, lingering there far longer than a passing glance required. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its usual polish. "Leave the linens. Someone will collect them. And Miss Hartley," he paused, as though reconsidering what he meant to say, "speak of this room to no one." "Yes, Your Grace." She left as quickly as her legs would carry her, but the image of the girl in blue followed her down every staircase, through every hallway, into the small attic room she shared with 2 other maids. She lay awake long after the candles were snuffed, staring at the low ceiling, trying to explain away what she had seen. Perhaps it was only a resemblance. Families that once lived in grand houses often left behind portraits of children who had grown and moved on, or who had died young, their faces preserved forever at the age they were lost. Perhaps it meant nothing. She had asked her aunt about it once, years ago, and the woman who raised her had given a vague answer about a fall near the orchard, spoken too quickly, her eyes sliding away as she said it. Rosalind had been young enough then to accept it without question. She was not young enough now. The next morning, the house moved at its usual brisk pace. Rosalind polished silver in the servants' hall, swept the long gallery, carried trays up and down stairs that never seemed to end, and all the while her mind returned again and again to the sealed room and the girl in the blue dress. She noticed, too, that the Duke watched her differently now, not with suspicion exactly, but with a kind of careful attention, as though she were a puzzle he had not decided whether to solve. Twice that day she caught him observing her from across a room, and twice he looked away the moment their eyes met. It was Mrs. Pembleton, the housekeeper, who noticed her distraction first. The older woman had run the household for over 20 years, her voice sharp but her heart soft toward the girls under her charge, and she pulled Rosalind aside in the linen closet with the particular bluntness of someone who had seen every kind of trouble a great house could produce. "You look as though you've seen a spirit," Mrs. Pembleton said. Rosalind hesitated. She wanted to speak of what she had found, wanted badly to share the weight pressing on her chest, but something in the older woman's guarded expression made her cautious. "I took a wrong turn yesterday. Into the East Wing." Mrs. Pembleton's hands went still on the folded sheets. "That wing is closed for a reason, girl. I saw a painting of a child." The color drained slightly from the housekeeper's face, quick enough that Rosalind almost missed it. "You saw nothing," Mrs. Pembleton said firmly. "Do you understand me? Whatever you think you saw, you say nothing of it. Not to the other staff, not to Mr. Drake, and certainly not to His Grace." "Mr. Drake asked me nothing," Rosalind said carefully, "but the Duke found me there." Something like fear passed briefly across Mrs. Pembleton's face before she composed herself. Then you must be even more careful. There are matters in this house older than your employment here, matters that concern people who would not take kindly to questions. She softened, just slightly, and touched Rosalind's arm. I am fond of you, child. Heed my warning. Let the past stay buried where it lies. The warning did nothing to ease Rosalind's mind. If anything, it deepened her unease, for a housekeeper did not speak with such fear over an old, forgotten portrait. There was something in that sealed room worth protecting, and somehow, impossibly, it seemed to be connected to her. That evening, she found an excuse to pass through the corridor near the steward's office, where Cornelius Drake kept the estate's records locked in tall cabinets. Drake had managed Wexford Hall's affairs for longer than anyone could recall, a thin, precise man with cold eyes, and a manner that made the younger staff uneasy. He rarely spoke to the maids directly, but as Rosalind passed his open door, he called her name. Miss Hartley. His voice was mild, almost pleasant, though something beneath it made her skin prickle. A word, if you please. She stepped inside. The office smelled of ink and old paper, ledgers stacked in careful towers along every wall. I understand you found yourself in the East Wing yesterday, Drake said, not looking up from the paper before him. I lost my way, sir. A curious mistake, for someone who has worked in this house for 3 years. He set down his pen and finally met her eyes. His gaze was unreadable, but something in it made her want to step back toward the door. I trust it will not happen again. No, sir. Good. He returned his attention to the ledger, dismissing her without another word. Rosalind left the office with her pulse racing, certain now that she had stumbled into something far larger than a forgotten room and a dusty painting. The way Drake had known so quickly, the way Mrs. Pembleton's fear had surfaced so fast, the way the Duke himself had reacted, none of it fit the explanation of an old family portrait left behind by chance. She thought of her aunt, gone 3 years now, buried in a small churchyard 2 counties away, and of all the questions she had never thought to ask while there had still been time. Who was the girl in the blue dress? Why did she share Rosalind's scar, Rosalind's eyes, Rosalind's very face? That night, unable to sleep, she took out the small wooden box she had inherited from her aunt, a box she had never fully emptied. Beneath old letters and a faded ribbon, her fingers found a folded paper she had never noticed before, tucked into a seam of the lining. She unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a fragment of a birth record, the ink faded, half the page torn away. The surname was missing, but the first name remained, clear enough to read by candlelight. Rosalind. The date matched her own birthday, but the location was not the village where she had always believed she was born. It was a name she had heard only once before, spoken in passing by an old groundskeeper who had mentioned, almost as a joke, that Wexford Hall once had a ward, a little girl who had vanished from the estate long before Rosalind had ever come to work there. Her hands shook as she refolded the paper and pressed it against her chest, staring into the darkness of the attic room, the sound of the other maid's quiet breathing filling the silence around her. Somewhere in this house, behind locked doors and careful lies, lay the truth of who she really was, and for the first time in her life, Rosalind Hartley understood that the ordinary story she had always believed about herself might never have been true at all. Rosalind did not sleep again that night. She sat by the window with the torn birth record spread across her knees, watching the gray light of early morning creep over the hills beyond Wexford Hall. By the time the house bell rang to wake the staff, she had already decided what she needed to do. She would find out the truth, whatever the cost, even if it meant defying every warning she had been given. The day passed in a blur of chores performed without thought. She dusted shelves she had already dusted, folded linens with unsteady hands, and twice forgot to deliver a tray that had been waiting since breakfast. Mrs. Pembleton noticed her distraction again but said nothing this time, only watched her with an expression of quiet worry that Rosalind found harder to bear than any scolding. It was late afternoon when the Duke summoned her. She had not expected it, and the request came not through Mrs. Pembleton but directly from one of the footmen, who told her simply that His Grace wished to see her in the library. Her stomach twisted as she smoothed her apron and climbed the stairs, certain that she was about to be dismissed for her trespass into the East Wing. Alaric Thorne stood by the tall windows when she entered, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in the manner of a man carrying more weight than his shoulders wanted to admit. He did not turn immediately. "Close the door, Miss Hartley." She did, her heart pounding. "I have thought of little else since yesterday," he said, finally facing her. His expression was harder to read than she expected, not the cold authority of a master addressing a servant, but something more uncertain, almost troubled. The portrait. You recognize something in it. Rosalind's throat went dry. She could deny it, could offer the safe and expected answer, but something in his tone told her that denial would serve no purpose here. I recognized myself, Your Grace. Though I cannot explain how that is possible. He studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lowered. Nor can I, fully. But I intend to find out. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit, please. She hesitated, unused to being invited to sit in his presence, but obeyed. That room has been sealed since before I inherited the title, he said. My uncle kept it locked, and when he passed, I saw no reason to disturb it. I was told the portrait belonged to a ward of the family, a child who lived here many years ago and who died in a fire on the eastern side of the property. I never questioned the story. Why would I? He paused, his jaw tightening. Until yesterday, when I saw your face beside hers and could not tell the two apart. Rosalind's pulse quickened. A fire, Your Grace? That is what I was told. My uncle rarely spoke of it, and when he did, it was with such grief that no one dared press him further. He moved to the desk and sat across from her, closer now, his gaze steady. Tell me about your childhood, your family, everything you remember. She told him what little she knew. The aunt who raised her in a modest cottage 2 counties away. The vague answers about her parents' early deaths. The fall from a tree that had never quite matched the shape of her scar. She told him about the fragment of the birth record hidden in her aunt's wooden box. The first name that matched her own. The missing surname, the reference to Wexford land. By the time she finished, the Duke's expression had shifted from careful curiosity to something graver. If what you say is true, he said slowly, then either you share an extraordinary resemblance to a child who died on this estate, or you are that child. And everything I was told about her death was a lie. The words hung heavy in the room. Rosalind pressed her hands together in her lap to keep them from trembling. Why would anyone lie about such a thing? I do not know, but I intend to learn. He rose, pacing toward the window again, his mind clearly working through possibilities she could not follow. My uncle's ward would have inherited a considerable sum upon reaching adulthood, land and funds set aside by her own late parents, held in trust by this estate until she came of age. If she did not die in that fire, if she was instead taken away and hidden under another name, then someone benefited greatly from the world believing her dead. Rosalind thought immediately of Cornelius Drake, of his cold eyes and the way he had summoned her to his office the moment word reached him of her discovery. She did not voice the thought aloud, not yet, uncertain whether it was wise to accuse a man who had served the family for decades. But the Duke, watching her closely, seemed to read the suspicion in her face regardless. You suspect someone, he said. I do not wish to make accusations without proof, Your Grace. Wise, he said, though something in his tone suggested he shared her suspicion already. We will proceed carefully. I do not want whoever is responsible to know how much we have already guessed. Over the following days, an uneasy alliance formed between them, one neither could fully explain nor entirely resist. The Duke arranged small excuses to speak with her, a request to reorganize books in the library, an errand that required her presence in the study, moments that allowed them to exchange information away from watching eyes. Rosalind found herself looking forward to these meetings with a feeling she dared not name, and more than once she caught him watching her with an expression that had nothing to do with lost inheritances or old fires. You must think me foolish, she said one evening, as they sat together over an old estate ledger he had smuggled from the records room, a maid, imagining herself the missing ward of a noble family. I think you observant, he said quietly. And I think, whatever the truth turns out to be, you deserve to know it. He hesitated, then added, in a voice softer than she had heard him use before. I also think, Miss Hartley, that I have not stopped thinking of you since the moment I found you standing before that portrait. The words settled between them, delicate and dangerous. Rosalind felt her cheeks warm, felt the impossible gap between their positions stretch and shrink all at once. Your Grace, I am a servant in your household. Whatever I might feel is no less real for the difference in our stations, he said, though I understand why you would hesitate to say so. Neither of them spoke further of it that night, but something had shifted, quietly and irreversibly, in the space between them. The ledger, when they finally examined it in full, revealed an unsettling gap. Records for the year of the fire were incomplete, several pages removed entirely, the binding disturbed in a way that suggested deliberate tampering rather than accidental damage. Payments to a solicitor in a distant town appeared shortly after the supposed death of the ward, payments that continued for several years before stopping abruptly. Around the time, Rosalind realized with a chill that she had come to live with the woman she believed was her aunt. Someone paid to have you placed elsewhere, the Duke said grimly, tracing the entries with his finger, and someone paid to make certain no one asked why. Rosalind stared at the numbers, at the careful handwriting that recorded her own hidden history in the cold language of estate finance, and felt the last of her old certainty about herself dissolve entirely. Whoever she had been before that fire, whoever her parents truly were, the answers lay buried somewhere in this house, protected by people who had spent years making certain they stayed that way. We need more than this ledger, the Duke said finally, closing the book with care. We need to know who removed those pages, and why. And we must do it without alerting Drake to how close we have already come. Rosalind nodded, though a cold unease settled over her at the mention of his name. She thought again of his office, of his mild, watchful eyes, and wondered how long he had known exactly who she was, and how far he might go to keep that truth buried. Days passed, and the fragile peace between Rosalind and the Duke grew harder to maintain. Cornelius Drake had begun watching her with open suspicion, finding reasons to appear wherever she worked, questioning the other maids about her habits and her movements through the house. She noticed it first in small things, a task reassigned without explanation, a conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, the way Drake's office door, once always ajar, now stayed firmly shut. "He knows we are looking into something," Rosalind said to the Duke one evening, as they met briefly in the library, under the pretense of an errand. "He has changed since I found the portrait." "He has always been careful," Alaric said. "But you are right. He is more careful now." He set down the ledger he had been studying, and rubbed his eyes, weariness etched into his face. "I have sent inquiries to the solicitor, whose name appears in the payment records. If we are fortunate, he will respond before Drake finds a way to silence the matter entirely." Rosalind wanted to believe fortune would favor them, but a cold unease had settled over her that no amount of reasoning could dislodge. She had seen the way Drake looked at her in the corridors now, not with the mild indifference of before, but with a calculating watchfulness that made her skin crawl. Her fears were confirmed 2 days later, when Mrs. Pembleton found her in the linen room, and pulled the door shut behind them with unusual urgency. "Mr. Drake has requested your reassignment," the housekeeper said without preamble. "He wants you sent to the dower house on the northern edge of the estate, effective immediately. Far from the main house, far from anyone who might ask questions." Rosalind's stomach dropped. "On what grounds?" "He claims you have been neglecting your duties. Distracted. Unreliable." Mrs. Pembleton's mouth tightened into a thin line. "We both know that is not the true reason." "Can he do this?" "He manages the staff assignments, yes. Unless His Grace intervenes directly, there is little I can do to stop it." The older woman hesitated, then reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. "Before you go anywhere, I want you to have this. I should have given it to you long ago, but I feared what it might mean if I did." Rosalind unwrapped the cloth with trembling fingers. Inside lay a small silver locket, tarnished with age, engraved with a pattern of intertwined leaves. She opened the clasp and found, inside, a tiny portrait, the same little girl from the sealed room, though younger still, her curls shorter, her smile brighter. "Where did you get this?" Rosalind whispered. "It belonged to a family that lived on this estate many years before you were born into service here. Or so we were told you were born elsewhere," Mrs. Pembleton said carefully. "A family called Ashcombe. The father was a distant cousin of the old Duke, wealthy in his own right, with a young daughter he adored beyond reason. When the fire came, it was said the whole family perished, all except the child, who was reported dead alongside them, though her body was never clearly identified among the ruins." Rosalind's breath caught. "Ashcombe. I do not know if that name means anything to you, but I kept this locket after the fire, hidden away, because something about the story never sat right with me. No one searched hard enough for that little girl's remains. No one asked enough questions, and when Cornelius Drake took charge of settling the family's affairs shortly after, the estate's fortunes shifted in his favor more than any steward's salary should allow." Mrs. Pembleton's eyes glistened, though her voice remained steady. "I have carried this suspicion alone for years, too afraid to speak it aloud. I am telling you now because I believe, whatever the danger, you deserve the truth more than I deserve my safety." Rosalind closed her hand around the locket, the metal warm now from her own grip. "Thank you," she managed, "for trusting me with this." "Do not thank me yet," Mrs. Pembleton said grimly. "Trust is a dangerous thing in this house. Guard that locket carefully, and guard yourself more carefully still. If Drake suspects what you now know, your reassignment to the dower house may be the least of what he attempts." That warning proved prophetic sooner than either of them expected. The following morning, As Rosalind carried a basket of mending down the servants' staircase, she noticed the top step had been swept unusually clean, free of the light dust that always gathered there by midweek. She thought nothing of it until her foot came down and found no purchase at all. The step gave way beneath her, some support beam clearly loosened, and she pitched forward with a cry, catching the railing only by desperate luck, her knees striking hard against the stone below. She sat there for a long moment, heart hammering, staring back up at the step that had betrayed her. It could have been an accident. Old houses settled and wood decayed. But when she examined the step more closely, she saw clean marks where a support had been deliberately pried loose, not the ragged edges of natural rot. And she said nothing to the other staff, but she went straight to the Duke. Elleric's face darkened as she described what she had found. He examined the step himself that afternoon, under the pretense of general household repairs, and confirmed what she already suspected. The damage had been made intentionally, positioned precisely where a maid carrying a heavy basket, unable to see her footing clearly, would be most likely to fall. "This is no longer a matter of quiet suspicion," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Someone in this house is willing to see you hurt, perhaps worse, to keep you from learning the truth." "Drake," Rosalind said quietly, "I cannot prove it yet. But I intend to." He took her hands in his, an intimacy that would have scandalized the household had anyone witnessed it, and looked at her with an intensity that made her chest ache. "I will not let anything happen to you. Whatever it takes, whatever the cost to this family's reputation, I will see this through to the truth." "And if the truth ruins you?" she asked. "If it shows that your own uncle knew of this deception, allowed it to happen, then it ruins me," he said simply. "I would rather live with a ruined name than live comfortably atop a lie that stole a child's entire life." His words settled something in her, a warmth that spread through the fear still gripping her chest. She thought of the little girl in the portrait, the little girl in the locket, the child who had somehow become the woman standing in this room, and felt for the first time a flicker of something like hope. Lady Frances Thorne, the Duke's younger sister, found them together that evening in the library, their heads bent close over the ledger and the newly discovered locket. Frances was sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued, known throughout the county for saying precisely what others thought but dared not voice, and she took in the scene before them with an assessing glance that missed nothing. "I have suspected for some time that something was amiss with Mr. Drake," she said, settling into a chair without invitation. "He has been unusually attentive to the northern properties these past years, properties that, if I recall correctly, once belonged to a family with no living heirs to inherit them." Her gaze moved to Rosalind with new interest, or so we were told. "You knew of the Ashcombe family?" Rosalind asked. "I knew of them vaguely, as a child hears half of everything and understands little of it. But I remember my uncle weeping once, quite unlike himself, over a letter he received shortly after the fire. I was young, and I did not understand it then. I understand it rather better now, looking at your face." Frances leaned forward, her expression losing its usual mocking edge. "Whatever you intend to do, I want to help. Drake has grown too comfortable in this house, and I have wanted an excuse to unseat him for years." The three of them talked long into the evening, piecing together fragments of memory, ledger entries, and the strange, damning silence that had surrounded the Ashcombe fire for over a decade. By the time Rosalind finally returned to her attic room, exhausted but no longer entirely alone in her fight, she understood that the coming days would bring the confrontation none of them could avoid much longer. She only hoped they would find the full truth before Drake found a way to silence it, and her, for good. The days that followed brought a strange new rhythm to Wexford Hall, one in which ordinary household routines carried on the surface while something far more dangerous moved beneath. Rosalind continued her duties as though nothing had changed, careful never to let Drake see the fear or the resolve that now lived side by side in her chest. But every spare moment she found was spent with the Duke and Lady Frances, piecing together a history that had been buried with painstaking care for over a decade. Frances proved a formidable ally. She had connections throughout the county that neither Rosalind nor Alaric possessed, and she used them without hesitation, calling on old family friends, former servants who had left Wexford's employ years before, anyone who might remember the Ashcombe family before the fire took their name from living memory. It was through one such visit, to a retired governess who had once taught the Ashcombe children their letters, that the fullest picture yet began to emerge. There were 2 children, the old woman told Frances, her voice trembling with age and old grief. A boy several years older and a little girl, the family's youngest and dearest. The boy died of a fever the winter before the fire, a tragedy that nearly broke his mother's heart entirely. When the fire came that spring, it took the parents outright. The girl was never found among the ruins, though everyone assumed the flames had simply left nothing to identify. Did anyone search for her elsewhere? Francis asked. Was there any possibility she survived? There were whispers, at the time, that a man had been seen leaving the estate early that morning, before the fire was even discovered, with a child wrapped in blankets in his arms. I did not think much of it then. Servants often carried children about the grounds, but I have wondered, over the years, whether that man might have been carrying the only survivor of that terrible night, and whether someone wished very much for the world to believe otherwise. When Francis relayed this account to Rosalind and the Duke that evening, the room fell into a heavy silence. A man carrying a child away from the fire, before it was even discovered, Alaric repeated slowly. That suggests the fire was set deliberately, and the girl was removed beforehand, not rescued from the flames but taken from harm's way entirely. Someone wanted her gone, but not dead, Rosalind said, the words feeling strange and terrible on her tongue. Someone arranged for her to disappear quietly, far from anyone who might recognize her, while letting the world believe the fire had claimed her along with her parents. And whoever arranged it stood to gain everything the family left behind, Francis added grimly. The land, the trust funds, the standing that came with managing an estate no living heir remained to claim. Rosalind thought again of Drake's careful, watchful eyes, of the payments in the ledger that stopped so abruptly the year she came to live with the woman she had called her aunt. Everything pointed toward him, and yet some part of her still hesitated to believe a man could carry out such a cruel deception, and continue serving the family he had wronged for over a decade without a flicker of remorse showing through. That hesitation vanished 3 days later. Rosalind had gone to the sealed room again, this time with the Duke's permission, and Lady Frances at her side, hoping some further clue might be hidden among the dust-covered furniture. They searched carefully through drawers and cabinets, finding little of use until Frances, examining the back of the portrait itself, discovered a folded letter tucked behind the canvas, wedged so tightly into the frame that it had escaped notice for years. The letter was addressed to the old Duke, written in a hand none of them recognized, and its contents made Rosalind's blood run cold. The writer, who signed only with the initial D, confirmed arrangements for the child's removal to a distant cottage, assured the old Duke that the girl would be well cared for under a new name, and requested continued discretion regarding the trust funds that would, in the girl's absence, remain conveniently unclaimed and available for careful management. The letter closed with an assurance that the fire, though tragic, had provided a convenient explanation that would satisfy any who asked too many questions. He knew, Rosalind whispered, staring at the letter. The old Duke knew I was alive. He helped arrange it. Alaric's face had gone pale as he read the letter over her shoulder. My uncle, he said quietly, was not a cruel man in the years I knew him, but grief and guilt can make people complicit in terrible things, especially when someone they trust convinces them it serves the greater good. He looked at Rosalind with something like anguish in his eyes. I am sorry. Whatever comfort my family's protection might have offered you, it came at the cost of your entire life. You did not do this, Rosalind said firmly. Whatever your uncle's part in it, you have done nothing but try to uncover the truth since the moment you found me standing before that portrait. He studied her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded in his expression. I have come to care for you, Rosalind, more deeply than I have any right to admit given everything still unresolved between us. Whatever your birth turns out to have been, common or noble, it changes nothing in how I feel. The words, spoken so plainly, undid something in her that she had held tightly guarded for weeks. Your Grace. Alaric, he corrected gently. Please. Alaric, she repeated, the name feeling strange and precious on her tongue. I do not know who I am yet, not fully. How can I allow myself to care for you when I cannot even be certain of my own name? Then let us find out together, he said, whoever you turn out to be, Ashcombe heiress or simply Rosalind Hartley. I find I do not much care which. I care only that you are safe, and that you remain close to me while we see this through. Frances, who had tactfully occupied herself examining the room's other contents during this exchange, cleared her throat pointedly. As touching as this is, might I remind you both that we still have a scheming steward to expose, and very little time before he grows desperate enough to try something worse than a loosened stare. The reminder sobered them both, though the warmth between them lingered, even as they turned back to the task at hand. They gathered the letter, the locket, and the ledger with its incomplete records, resolving that the moment they had sufficient proof, they would confront Drake before he could destroy the remaining evidence or attempt further harm. But Cornelius Drake, it soon became clear, had already sensed how close they had come to the truth. That very night, as Rosalind made her way back to the attic room, she noticed a faint smell of smoke drifting from the direction of the estate's record room, the very chamber where the ledgers and remaining papers concerning the Ashcombe Trust were kept locked away. She raised the alarm at once, and the household staff worked quickly to douse the small fire before it could spread, but when the smoke cleared, they found the record room's most important cabinet had been deliberately set alight, its contents reduced to ash beyond recovery. Drake, when questioned, expressed shock and concern equal to anyone else in the household, offering no explanation beyond suggesting a candle left carelessly burning. But Rosalind, watching his face in the flickering lamplight, saw no trace of the surprise a truly innocent man would have shown. He knew they were close. And now, with the physical evidence destroyed, he would stop at nothing to ensure the truth never left this house alive. The fire in the record room changed everything. What had been a quiet, careful search for truth now became an open race against a man who had proven he was willing to destroy evidence, and perhaps far more, to protect himself. Alaric doubled the household's caution, quietly instructing the most trusted servants to watch over Rosalind whenever she moved through the house, though he was careful not to alert Drake to the depth of their suspicion. "We cannot simply accuse him without proof," Frances said, pacing the length of the library the following morning, her earlier composure replaced by restless energy. "He will deny everything, claim the fire was accidental, and turn the household against us for making wild accusations against a man who has served this family for over 20 years. The letter survived," Rosalind reminded her, "and the locket. Whatever he burned in that cabinet, he could not have known we had already removed the most important pieces." "He may not know exactly what we have," Alaric said, "but he will not risk waiting to find out. We need to move quickly, and we need something beyond a single letter and an old photograph to bring him down entirely." It was Frances who suggested the solution. Her connections in the county included a solicitor who had once handled minor legal matters for the Ashcombe family before their deaths, a man now retired but still sharp of mind, living quietly in a nearby town. If any formal record of the Ashcombe Trust still existed outside Wexford Hall's own burned archives, he would be the one to know of it. They traveled together the following day, Rosalind dressed in one of Frances's more modest gowns to avoid drawing unwanted attention, the three of them presenting themselves at the solicitor's modest home under the pretense of a routine estate inquiry. The old solicitor, a Mr. Calder, listened to their careful explanation with growing astonishment, his eyes moving repeatedly to Rosalind's face as though comparing it against some memory he could not quite place. "You have her look," he murmured finally, "the elder Ashcombe girl, though I knew her only as an infant before I retired from active practice. Astonishing." He rose slowly and moved to an old cabinet in the corner of his study, producing after some searching a thin folder of yellowed papers. "I kept copies of every document I handled in my career, a habit my former partners thought excessive. It seems, in this case, excessive caution has served a purpose after all." The folder contained a copy of the original trust agreement, establishing funds for the Ashcombe daughter to be held until her 21st birthday, or her marriage, whichever came first, under the guardianship of the estate's steward, in the event both parents should die before that time. It also contained, crucially, a witness statement from the physician who had examined the remains found after the fire, noting that only 2 bodies, both adult, had been recovered from the wreckage, with no trace whatsoever of a third, smaller victim. "This was never presented at the time?" Alaric asked, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I do not know why it was not," Mr. Calder said, troubled. "I handled only the initial paperwork. The matter passed afterward into the estate's own management, and I confess I gave it little further thought until this very moment." With the physician's statement and the trust agreement in hand, alongside the letter and locket already in their possession, they finally had what they needed. Proof not only that the Ashcombe heiress had survived the fire, but that someone within the estate's management had deliberately suppressed evidence of her survival to maintain control over her inheritance. They returned to Wexford Hall as evening fell, their spirits lifted by the discovery but their unease deepening with every mile closer to the house. Drake would surely notice their extended absence, and a man who had already resorted to arson to protect his secrets might well grow desperate enough to attempt something far worse before they could bring the truth into the open. Their fears proved well-founded. As their carriage rolled up the drive, Mrs. Pembleton met them at the door, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Mr. Drake has been asking for Miss Hartley all afternoon," she said quickly. "He claims urgent estate business requires her assistance in the north wing. I told him she had accompanied you and Lady Frances into town, but he did not seem to believe me. He has been most insistent, Your Grace, in a manner I have never seen from him before. Alaric's expression darkened. Where is he now? In his office, I believe, though he left not 10 minutes past, saying he intended to check the northern storerooms himself. The northern storerooms, Rosalind realized with a chill, lay directly beneath the sealed east wing, connected by an old servant's passage rarely used since the days before the fire. If Drake intended some final act of destruction, some last attempt to erase whatever evidence might yet remain within the house itself, that passage would offer him both access and concealment. We must stop him, she said, already moving toward the servant's entrance. Rosalind, wait. Alaric caught her arm, his grip firm but not unkind. If he is desperate enough to have already committed arson, I will not have you facing him without protection. Francis, send word to the constable in the village. Tell him we have urgent need of his presence at Wexford Hall. I will not wait for his arrival to confront Drake myself. They moved together through the old passage, lit only by a single lantern Alaric carried, the air growing colder and staler the deeper they went. Rosalind's heart pounded with every step, memories of the sealed room and the portrait that had begun this entire ordeal rising vividly in her mind. She thought of the little girl in the blue dress, of the parents she would never remember, of the years stolen from her by a man's careful, calculated greed. They found Drake in the northern storeroom exactly as Mrs. Pembleton had warned, a lamp burning low beside him as he worked frantically through a stack of old papers, feeding pages one by one into a small brazier that already glowed with the remains of several destroyed documents. Drake, Alaric's voice cut through the room like a blade, stop this instant. Drake froze, his hand still holding a half-burned page above the flames. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, he straightened, his expression shifting from alarm to something colder, more resigned. Your Grace, he said, his voice carefully controlled despite the sweat visible at his temples. I did not expect you back so soon. Clearly not, Alaric said. What is it you are so eager to destroy, Drake? More records of the Ashcombe Trust, more evidence of a fire you arranged to cover a theft you have profited from for over a decade. Drake's composure finally cracked. You do not understand the position I was placed in, he said, his voice rising. The old Duke came to me in desperation, unable to bear the thought of losing another child from that family after the boy's death the previous winter. He begged me to find some way to spare her, to remove her from a house that had become cursed with grief. I did what he asked of me. I saved her life, and profited handsomely from her supposed death in the years that followed, Rosalind said, stepping forward despite the fear tightening her chest. You did not save me out of kindness, Mr. Drake. You saved me because a living, forgotten ward, hidden far from anyone who might recognize her, was far more useful to you than a dead one whose inheritance might have been properly settled and beyond your reach. Drake's eyes fixed on her with something between hatred and grudging respect. Clever girl, you always were, even as a child. I remember that much. At least, from the arrangements I made for your care. Enough, Alaric said sharply. You will answer for this before the proper authorities, Drake. Every falsified record, every stolen shilling from her inheritance, every year of her life spent believing herself an orphan with no history worth knowing. You will answer for all of it. Drake's gaze flicked toward the brazier, toward the passage behind him, calculation clear in his expression even as the walls of his careful deception collapsed around him. And in that instant, Rosalind understood that a cornered man, having already resorted to fire once to protect his secrets, would not hesitate to attempt something far more desperate now that his final concealment had failed. Drake moved suddenly, shoving past Alaric toward the passage that led deeper into the old storerooms, the lantern in his hand throwing wild shadows across the stone walls as he fled. Alaric caught his arm before he could disappear into the darkness, and the two men grappled briefly in the narrow space, the brazier's coals scattering dangerously close to a stack of old crates. Rosalind, get back, Alaric shouted, wrestling to keep Drake from breaking free. She did not retreat far, snatching up a heavy iron poker from beside the brazier instead, ready to defend herself, and the man she had come to love, if the confrontation turned any more violent than it already had. But the struggle ended almost as quickly as it began, Drake's strength no match for the Duke's, and within moments Alaric had pinned him firmly against the stone wall, breathing hard but otherwise unharmed. It is over, Drake, Alaric said, his voice low and dangerous. Whatever you hope to accomplish tonight, it ends here. Drake sagged against the wall, the fight draining out of him as suddenly as it had flared. You do not understand what I built, he said bitterly. 20 years of careful management, of protecting this estate's fortunes when the old Duke could barely manage his own grief. I earned every shilling I ever took from that trust. You earned nothing, Rosalind said, her voice steady despite the tremor still running through her hands. You stole a childhood from a girl who never had the chance to know her own name. You let me grow up believing myself an orphan of no consequence, when I had a family, a history, an entire life that was taken from me before I was old enough to remember it. Before Drake could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the passage, and moments later the village constable arrived alongside two of the household's footmen, summoned by Francis's urgent message, and arriving just in time to take custody of the steward, who had spent over a decade building his fortune on a foundation of carefully maintained lies. The days that followed brought a whirlwind of revelation to Wexford Hall and the surrounding county. Drake's full confession, given under formal questioning, confirmed every detail Rosalind and Alaric had pieced together. The fire deliberately set to conceal the removal of a grieving family's surviving child, the falsified records maintaining her death in the public record, the decade of quiet embezzlement from a trust fund that technically remained unclaimed because its rightful heir was believed lost forever. The old Duke's role in the deception, once it came to light, cast a complicated shadow over the family's reputation, though Alaric refused to let that history remain buried any longer than the truth about Rosalind herself. He testified openly to what they had discovered, accepting the difficult scrutiny that followed, rather than allow any further concealment to protect his family's name at Rosalind's expense. You did not have to be so honest, Rosalind told him one evening, as they sat together in the library that had become, over the preceding weeks, something like a shared sanctuary between them. You could have protected your uncle's memory, softened the details, let the county believe whatever comfortable version of events suited the family best. I could have, Alaric agreed. But I have watched you carry the weight of a stolen life for weeks now, weeks that have shown me exactly what courage looks like when someone chooses truth over comfort, again and again, even when the truth threatened everything she thought she knew about herself. I could not, in good conscience, ask any less of myself. The formal legal proceedings that followed confirmed what the trust documents and physician's statement had already suggested. Rosalind Hartley was, beyond any reasonable doubt, the surviving daughter of the Ashcombe family, thought lost in the fire that had claimed her parents over 16 years earlier. The inheritance long held in careful, corrupt management now passed fully into her control, along with land holdings and standing that transformed her, almost overnight, from a housemaid into one of the county's most notable young heiresses. The change unsettled her more than she expected. She had spent her entire remembered life believing herself ordinary, unremarkable, a girl of modest means with no particular claim on the world's attention. To suddenly find herself an heiress, courted by distant relations she had never known existed, and regarded with new deference by household staff who had, until recently, considered her their equal, left her feeling strangely unmoored. I do not know how to be this person, she admitted to Alaric one afternoon, standing before the very portrait that had begun this entire journey, now moved from the sealed room into the main gallery where it belonged among the family's other treasured likenesses. The little girl in this painting feels like a stranger to me still, even knowing now that she was once myself. Then do not try to become her, Alaric said gently, coming to stand beside her. You are not required to reclaim some lost version of yourself entirely. You have lived 16 years as Rosalind Hartley, and everything you learned in that life, your patience, your resourcefulness, your quiet courage, belongs to you regardless of what name or fortune the world now attaches to it. Let the Ashcombe inheritance be a part of your story, not the whole of it. His words settled something in her chest that had felt unsteady for weeks. She turned to face him, studying the man who had stood beside her through every terrifying revelation, who had risked his family's reputation and his own comfort to see justice done on her behalf. I love you, she said, the words arriving with a clarity that surprised her even as she spoke them. Whatever name I carry, whatever fortune now follows it, that has not changed since the moment you found me standing before this very painting. Alaric's expression softened into something she had rarely seen from him, a warmth entirely unguarded. I have loved you, I think, since that same moment, he admitted, though I told myself for weeks that it was merely concern for a woman caught in a dangerous mystery. I have run out of patience for pretending otherwise. He took her hands in his, and there in the gallery, surrounded by generations of Thorne family portraits and the newly restored painting of a little girl who had finally reclaimed her rightful place, he asked her to marry him. Rosalind did not hesitate before answering. The scandal surrounding Drake's arrest and Rosalind's restored identity dominated county conversation for weeks afterward, But the story that emerged, in the end, was not one of shame but of resilience. A woman who had refused to accept a comfortable lie once the truth revealed itself, and a duke who had chosen honesty over easy silence, whatever the cost to his family's polished reputation. Cornelius Drake stood trial in the following months, the full weight of his decade of theft and deception laid bare before the court. The evidence Rosalind, Alaric, and Francis had gathered proved more than sufficient to secure his conviction, and he was sentenced to transportation, his once respected name forever tied to the scandal he had spent so many years trying to prevent. Mrs. Pembleton wept openly when Rosalind thanked her for the courage it had taken to finally share the locket and the suspicions she had carried alone for so many years. "I should have spoken sooner," the housekeeper said, embracing her with a warmth that had nothing to do with station or title. "But I am glad, more than I can say, that you found your way to the truth regardless." Lady Frances, for her part, declared herself thoroughly satisfied with having finally unseated a steward she had distrusted for years, and took considerable pleasure in reminding both Rosalind and Alaric, at every available opportunity, that the entire investigation would have moved far more slowly without her particular talents for gathering information. As autumn settled over Wexford Hall, bringing with it the golden light that had once illuminated a lost little girl's portrait in a sealed and forgotten room, Rosalind Hartley, soon to be Rosalind Ashcombe Thorne, stood once more before that painting, no longer haunted by the stranger's face staring back at her, but grateful, finally, to recognize herself. Winter came early that year, wrapping Wexford Hall in a hush of frost and pale light, and with it came the quiet, deliberate rhythms of a household settling into a new and long-awaited chapter. The wedding took place in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds, attended not by the grand assembly of nobility one might expect for a duke's marriage, but by a modest gathering of those who had stood beside Rosalind through the darkest weeks of her discovery. Mrs. Pembleton, radiant with pride as she watched from the front pew, Lady Frances, who had insisted on selecting the flowers herself, and declared the arrangement her finest achievement yet, and Mr. Calder, the old solicitor, who had traveled from his quiet retirement to witness the conclusion of a story he had helped bring into the light. Rosalind wore no elaborate gown weighted with jewels, choosing instead a simple dress of pale blue that echoed, without either of them remarking on it aloud, the color of the little girl's dress in the portrait that had started everything. Alaric, watching her walk toward him down the narrow aisle, felt certain he had never seen anything so entirely right in all his life. Their life together in the months that followed was not without its adjustments. Rosalind found herself navigating a world of formal calls and county obligations that felt, at times, as foreign to her as the sealed room had once seemed familiar. But she approached each new challenge with the same quiet determination that had carried her through weeks of danger and uncertainty, and slowly, steadily, she began to feel less like an imposter wearing someone else's inheritance, and more like a woman fully claiming a life that had always, in truth, belonged to her. Ashcombe fortune, to establish a small fund for household staff across the county, ensuring that servants who suffered injury or hardship in the course of their work would never again find themselves as vulnerable as she once had been, dependent entirely on the goodwill of employers who did not always deserve their trust. Mrs. Pembleton, upon learning of this decision, wept for the second time that year, insisting it was precisely the kind of thoughtful gesture she had always known Rosalind capable of, long before anyone knew her true name. The sealed room in the East Wing, once a place of secrets and sorrow, was opened permanently that spring, its furniture uncovered, its windows thrown wide to let in light that had not touched the space in over 16 years. Alaric had the room restored not as a shrine to loss, but as a nursery, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever grief had once been locked away within those walls, new life and new hope now had every right to fill the space instead. Lady Frances remained a near constant presence at Wexford Hall throughout that first year, her sharp wit and fierce loyalty proving as valuable in ordinary domestic matters as they had been during the investigation that uncovered Drake's decade of deception. She took particular delight in reminding visitors, whenever the story of Rosalind's discovery arose in conversation, that she had been instrumental in securing the evidence that finally brought the truth to light, a claim that was, in fairness, entirely true. Cornelius Drake's name faded slowly from county conversation as the months passed, his crimes eventually overshadowed by newer scandals and the ordinary business of country life. Rosalind found, to her own surprise, that she carried little lasting bitterness toward the man who had stolen so much from her. He had, after all, been the one to carry her from the fire that night, whatever selfish calculations had followed that single act of preservation. She chose, in the end, to remember that fact alongside everything else, understanding that even the most complicated histories rarely divided as cleanly into villains and heroes as the stories told about them afterward might suggest. The portrait that had begun it all found a permanent home in the main gallery, hung now beside a newly commissioned painting of Rosalind as she was in the present, a deliberate pairing that Alaric had arranged as a wedding gift, meant to honor both the child she had been and the woman she had become. Visitors to Wexford Hall often paused before the two paintings, remarking on the family resemblance before learning, to their considerable astonishment, that both portraits depicted the very same person, separated by 16 years and an entire hidden lifetime. On quiet evenings, when the demands of the estate finally allowed a moment's rest, Rosalind would sometimes find herself back in that gallery, standing exactly where she had once stood as a frightened maid confronting an impossible resemblance in a locked and forgotten room. The fear that had gripped her that night had long since faded, replaced by something steadier and far more precious. The simple, hard-won certainty of knowing, at last and beyond any doubt, exactly who she was. She was Rosalind, daughter of the Ashcombes, once lost and long presumed dead, wife to the Duke of Wexford, who had risked everything to help her find the truth, and mistress, now, of the very hall where her story had once nearly been erased entirely, standing tall in the light of a room that had finally, after so many years of silence, learned how to hold nothing but the truth.